Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Janelle Brush. I'm with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and I'm here today with members of the Shorebird Data Team who have developed statewide breeding abundance estimates for Florida's focal species of shorebirds and seabirds. Today, Cody Griffin will present the analysis strategy and final abundance estimates for 3 species of shorebirds. Please keep yourself muted, and if you're having technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. We invite you to type questions into the chat following the presentation. We will be recording the webinar today and we'll let everyone know when it's been posted on YouTube. I'm going to turn it over to Cody now. Enjoy the presentation.
Thanks, Janelle. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the Florida Shorebird Abundance webinar. My name is Cody Griffin, and I'm the quantitative analyst for the Florida Shorebird program. On behalf of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's Shorebird Data Team, I'll be presenting the 2019 abundance estimates for Wilson's plovers, snowy plover, American oystercatcher. There are several people joining us today from outside Florida, so before we get into the shorebird abundance analysis details, I will begin this presentation with an overview of shorebird and seabird monitoring challenges and strategies in Florida. There are over 1,300 linear miles of coastline in Florida and over 8,000 miles, including tidal inlets. So there's a lot of potential habitat for shorebirds and seabirds. However, each year, over 21 million residents and visitors in Florida share this habitat with shorebirds. This human-shorebird interaction has created conditions that limit potential breeding habitat, and birds depend on conservation actions for survival and reproduction. The amount of potential breeding habitat, combined with the number of people on our beaches, has created unique monitoring and conservation challenges. Realizing that conservation and management of these species is beyond the reach of any one agency or organization, the Florida Shorebird Alliance, or FSA, was created to coordinate conservation actions and expand resources. The FSA is a statewide network of conservation partners committed to advancing shorebird and seabird conservation in Florida. The FSA facilitates better communication, improved monitoring coordination, and sustained monitoring and management at the statewide level. More than 200 FSA partners monitor survey routes each year, covering over 550 miles of potential shorebird nesting habitat. That adds up to over 20,500 miles when you consider repeat surveys. Partners monitor nesting birds within distinct population recovery regions, or imperiled beach nesting bird regions, that have unique habitat types, threats, and population recovery goals. FSA partners follow a standardized monitoring protocol called the Breeding Bird Protocol for Florida shorebirds and seabirds. It provides a standardized framework that partners can use to monitor the birds and record data. It is accompanied by guidance documents to help clarify key concepts. The protocol ensures that monitoring is coordinated and standardized to produce highly accurate research-grade data. Partners then enter data into the Florida Shorebird Database. With such a wealth of monitoring data, it's essential to have a sophisticated tool to store it. The Florida Shorebird Database, or FSD, serves as a central repository for all of Florida's beach nesting bird data. It is made up of a front-end web application where partners can enter and explore their data, and a back-end relational database where the data is stored. The FSD provides infrastructure that allows us to query the data for every analysis, and its online interface allows us to check every record for quality and accuracy. It also provides an easy-to-use tool for partners and managers to explore the entire data set. The analysis I'm presenting today is the first time that we relied primarily on data in the FSD to produce statewide abundance estimates for shorebirds. Let's go back to the protocol for a minute and review some key concepts to keep in mind while I walk you through the development of the abundance estimates. The FSA partners conduct surveys in areas with potential nesting habitat from mid-February to mid-September. The protocol has a flexible framework that allows partners to create routes of any length necessary to survey in a single day while covering as much potential habitat as possible. The Breeding Bird Protocol guides observers to count the number of breeding adults along each route. The adult counts include those at nests, with broods, or birds that were not counted at a nest or with a brood during a survey but were considered part of the breeding population. We refer to these adults as additional breeding adults. First, we will dive into the dataset, and I'll show how the movement of birds can influence counts. Some shorebird species begin nesting in mid-February, and the nesting season ends around mid-September. Let's revisit the way monitors can report breeding adults along their route in space and time. The adult counts include those at a nest, adults with broods, and additional breeding adults, birds that were not counted at a nest or with a brood during a survey but were considered part of the breeding population. For example, birds could be exhibiting territorial behavior between nesting attempts or away from nests or broods during the time of the survey. Movements are associated with renesting, foraging, and brood rearing, but the travel distances are usually species specific. During the nesting season, FSA monitors documented breeding adults along their survey route, and it was up to the data team to find a strategy to account for this movement within and between routes to avoid double counting breeding adults and overestimate the number of breeding individuals. Some of you may remember seeing the puzzle graphic in the 2021 Monitoring Data at Work report. I will use this graphic as a starting point for introducing the four major pieces of the analysis and how we accounted for movement. We truncated the data to a nesting period when movement was limited. We grouped routes with possible movement to form nesting polygons. We focused on breeding areas with confirmed nesting. And finally, we generated counts using a 10-day moving window. We assume birds move between routes that were grouped, so the 10-day moving window assumes that movement is limited within a 10-day span. We developed a process that used FSD data supplemented with band resite data to determine when movement was limited, find overlapping routes, assess how far birds moved to renest, evaluate where renest grouping needed to be expanded, and verify if counts were in areas with nesting activity. We also use supplemental band resite data to evaluate the FSD movement information to expand any grouping when necessary. I will go into more detail for each step in the next several slides. I added a menu bar to track the steps as I walk you through the analysis. We define the nesting period, or peak nesting, as the time when birds were least likely to be moving in and out of the breeding population. The first step in the process was to truncate the time frame of data we used to capture peak nesting. The abundance of breeding individuals increases as birds initiate nesting in early spring. The number of active breeders in the population decreases as nesting concludes and chicks fledge. Determine when breeding activity was greatest for each species, and define the nesting period as the date range that encompassed the highest adult counts, the occurrence of nesting peaks, and early peaks for brood rearing adults. The resulting nesting period dates were unique to each species. The nesting period for Wilson's plovers was from April 14th to June 24th. Snowy's plovers ranged from March 10th to June 19th, and American oystercatchers ranged from March 1st to June 24th. In the next few slides, I will present the process in a hypothetical scenario using American oystercatchers as an example species. The breeding bird protocol allows flexibility in how partners can create routes to align with their monitoring objectives. For instance, a partner surveying a state park may only survey within the park's boundaries, while other partners might expand that survey to include adjacent properties. This example shows a similar scenario. You can see that both routes likely detect the same nesting American oystercatchers where they overlap, and those routes would be double counted if we assume the routes were independent. However, they also could detect nesting birds in areas with no overlap. We merge the counts between routes by keeping the highest daily count of adults, which produce one count per day for the merged routes. Now I'm going to zoom out to show how we accounted for movement between routes. At this extent, you can see there are 9 total routes, including the duplicate routes from the previous slide. The goal of this step was to group routes with probable movement to minimize the risk of double counting. So how did we determine what movement is probable? We used 8 years of data in the FSD plus band resite data to obtain the species-specific distances birds moved to renest. We ended up with over 780 records with valuable renest information. This produced a range of distances that were unique to each species. The 85th percentile resulted in a distance that best grouped routes without under or over grouping, and we used band resites to verify. We also used the 99th and 10th percentiles to produce a range of uncertainty, which I'll reference again later in this presentation. We use these renest distances to establish buffers around routes that reflect the distance we anticipate birds to move, and grouped routes when the buffers overlapped. We refer to these buffers as renest buffers. We used FSD to obtain species-specific distances birds moved from the previous nest to the new nest. This produced a range of distances that were unique to each species, and we used the 85th percentile of renest distances for the abundance estimate, as mentioned earlier. In this scenario, we buffered the routes by a renest distance. You can see that some buffers overlapped, and when this happened, we assumed there was the potential for movement between the routes over the course of the breeding season. When the boundaries are dissolved, you can see how the routes with a high likelihood of movement become grouped together. Expanding the groups was necessary when areas with no movement within the nesting period were not grouped by the renesting buffers. Resites of abandoned birds allowed us to identify those routes. We reviewed each route buffer with the band resite data and relied on knowledge from biologists to determine which routes needed to have the grouping expanded. In this scenario, there are some routes that were not grouped by the renest buffers, but we know there is movement among them. So larger polygons are manually drawn. Although there was no extended grouping beyond the independent routes on the left and right, we consider those routes in the extended groups as nesting polygons. We reviewed a wealth of nesting information from the past years and consulted with biologists to verify routes in areas with no known nesting activity. And these routes were likely in foraging areas. Although we excluded these routes from the data in this analysis to prevent overinflating the abundance estimates, they are still important for other aspects of shorebird research and management. The final process in this analysis was to generate counts from routes within each nesting polygon. We expect breeding adults to move between routes within each nesting polygon over the course of the nesting period, but we assume that routes are independent and movement is limited within a 10-day span. We generated the counts from routes within the nesting polygon by implementing a 10-day moving window process that extracts the maximum count per route within a window, sums those counts, and shifts one day until the end of the breeding season. In this example, there are daily counts across 3 routes within a nesting polygon. When we apply the 10-day window, the max count for route 1 is 12, route 2 is 10, and route 3 is 11. We sum those values to produce a count of 33 adults for this window. The window shifts one day and the process is repeated. 12 is no longer the maximum count for route 1, and all the others stay the same, which produce 34 breeding adults. Window shifts again, summing the max counts within the window. Now I will shift the window each day until the last survey. Here are the counts recorded for each daily window shift. We calculated the maximum count of these values, which resulted in 41 breeding adults for this nesting polygon. We repeated this process for all nesting polygons and summed the breeding adults to produce the abundance estimate. Now let's revisit this slide to show how we use the renest distance percentiles to represent the uncertainty in our counts of breeding adults. We calculated an abundance range relative to the uncertainty of how far birds typically move to renest. We repeated the route buffering and moving window process using the 99th and 10th percentiles of renest distances. The 99th percentile renest distance was more conservative, which represented the risk of overgrouping routes, accounting for the lower boundary of the abundance estimate. The figure on the right represents how the routes would be grouped using the 99th percentile, which produced 5 polygons. The renest distance in the 10th percentile allowed for more independence between routes, which represented the upper boundary. The bottom figure shows the routes buffered by the 10th percentile of renest distances. which produced 7 polygons, 2 more independent route groups than the lower boundary. Increasing the renest buffer distance produces fewer independent routes, as shown in the top figure, while decreasing the distance produces more independent routes, as in the bottom figure. FSA partners have dedicated an incredible amount of effort to surveying shorebird, and because of this, we are able to control for factors that could inflate counts, such as movement between routes. Partners surveyed between 64 and 94 routes and between 344 kilometers to 583 kilometers across all species. Routes were surveyed an average of 13 or more times during the nesting period in 2019, and that equates to almost 1 survey per week. Breeding birds foraging and not present at the route during a survey can cause counts to fluctuate, so multiple visits during the season are important. Thanks to the huge effort of our FSA partners, more than 75% of all surveys for all species were conducted 10 or fewer days apart. The 2019 abundance estimate for breeding Wilson's plovers was 912 individuals. They were documented in all regions except the Southeast. The 85th percentile of renest distances, which we used to generate the estimate, was 0.4 kilometers, and the range was between 0.01 and 2.9 kilometers. The route grouping process resulted in 44 nesting polygons for all regions but the South. The estimates for the South region were derived from a separate study in 2019 that estimated the population using a double observer method. The results represent the population size with 95% confidence intervals, which were added to the statewide abundance. More information can be found at the 2020 FSA Monitoring Data at Work report. The Northeast region had the largest breeding concentration, with 31% of the statewide population. The 2019 abundance estimate for breeding snowy plovers was 359 individuals. Breeding snowy plovers were documented only in the Northwest and Southwest regions. The 85th percentile of renest distances, which we used to generate the estimate, was 2.3 kilometers, and the range was between 0.02 and 88.9 kilometers. The route grouping process resulted in 18 nesting polygons. In the Northwest region, had the largest breeding concentration, with 79% of the statewide population. The 2019 abundance estimate for breeding American oystercatchers was 455 individuals. Oystercatchers were documented in all regions except the South. The 85th percentile of renest distances, which we used to generate the estimate, was 0.08 kilometers, and the range was between 0.003 and 1.2 kilometers. On the map to the right, you'll notice that the abundance range is very narrow. This is because American oystercatchers don't move far to renest. The route grouping process resulted in 47 nesting polygons, and 14 adults were reported nesting on rooftops in Pinellas County, which were added to the ground nesting count. The Big Bend region had the largest concentration, with 27% of the statewide population. Florida Shorebird Alliance partners were essential for this analysis. We thank them because we would not be able to do this without their frequent and reliable surveys. Their hard work allowed us to develop a process that incorporated knowledge of bird movement and minimized the risk of double counting to estimate shorebird abundance. These are the first shorebird estimates produced using tools tailored to the data in the FSD. This analysis considered asynchronous nesting, potential movement of renesting birds, and local knowledge. These are the best abundance estimates available and should be used until they are updated with new data. The goal of any conservation program is to increase declining populations, and this analysis is a major milestone in Florida's mission to restore imperiled shorebird populations. In 2013, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission developed a species action plan in response to the listing of American oystercatchers and snowy plovers as threatened in the state of Florida. Although not listed, Wilson's plovers are a species of greatest conservation need, and management of the other 2 species will benefit their populations. The plan includes various conservation actions needed to enhance populations to achieve their recovery goals. The abundance estimate presented here and future estimates will be used to generate trends and gauge the effectiveness of conservation actions. Estimates produced from this process will serve as the basis for evaluating the listing status of each species as the populations reach their recovery goals. The next step in the process is to produce a peer-reviewed manuscript to document the analysis in detail, to reference as we move forward to produce future estimates. We are working to produce the 2020 and 2021 abundance estimates for both shorebirds and seabirds. And we are currently working to develop an analysis strategy to estimate population trends. I also want to remind everyone about the 2020 and 2021 FSA monitoring data at work reports that are available at the Florida Shorebird Alliance website. The reports summarize how FSA monitoring data is used to measure progress towards conservation goals, identify information gaps, and adaptively manage for the long-term recovery of shorebird and seabird populations. These reports are filled with useful information about shorebird and seabird conservation goals and strategies, monitoring effort, conservation and management effort and outcomes, abundance estimates, rooftop nesting trends, hurricane impacts, filling data gaps, and species fact sheets. We would like to thank the network of 12 partnerships that make up the Florida Shorebird Alliance for providing top-notch data. Your contributions help guide conservation management actions and ultimately lead to the protection of Florida's beach nesting birds. If you would like additional information about the analysis, please email us at flshorebirddatabase@myfwc.com. If you'd like to learn more about the Florida Shorebird Alliance, please email shorebird@myfwc.com. Thank you for joining the webinar today. I'll hand it back over to Janelle.
Thank you, Cody. I invite everyone, if you have questions, just type them into the chat and we'll answer them as we receive them. Again, I'll note that we recorded this webinar and we're going to post it on YouTube, and we'll let everybody know when it's posted. I know there were some people who had hoped to attend that weren't able to today, so that way it'll be available for others to watch later. Michelle, introduce yourself and ask us your question.
I'm Michelle Van Deventer with FWC, this Critical Wildlife Area Coordinator. And first of all, I just want to applaud the effort on pulling this together. These are challenging species to come up with these kinds of data sets for, and it's great to see how you guys went about tackling this problem, and kind of how the sausage was made on this. One question I had was if the answers you've been able to pull together through this effort gives you an idea of some of the trends that for these species that you've been trying to tease out over the last couple of years for the populations. I know it's been really challenging. When we started with looking at the population sizes for the state back in 2010, we used to use terms like, is it bigger than a bread box or smaller than a bread box, because we had such rough estimates. So it might be an unfair question, but I just wanted to see if you had an idea of what you can determine from trends for these species based on going through this process.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Michelle. And I think it also feeds into the question that Marvin asked in the chat, which was, why was 2019 the baseline? So I don't know, Emma, if you want to start with answering why was 2019 used as the baseline, and then we can kick it over to Rhea maybe to talk a little bit more about trend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm Emma LeClaire. I'm the data engineer for the Shorebird program with FWC. And so Marvin, that's a great question about the baseline. And we have a couple of reasons to use 2019 as the baseline for our abundance estimates. The short-term goal in the Florida Beach Nesting Bird Plan was to increase populations by 10% over 10 years, and measuring that growth starts in 2019 for the purpose of that plan. And for shorebirds specifically, there were also several changes to the monitoring protocol and the database that led up to the 2019 breeding season. And so I can describe those a little bit. We know that the number of breeding adults documented along the survey route was the most important metric that we needed to be able to calculate the abundance of breeding shorebirds. So in 2019, we refined the breeding bird protocol and the FSD to make it a little bit more efficient and less ambiguous for monitoring partners to report the number of adults that they see along their route. We provided better definitions for breeding adults. We created a new feature in the FSD online application so that partners can enter the additional breeding adults that they observe along the route, even if those adults were not observed with nests or with broods. We also, in 2019, added a requirement that the surveys had to be conducted along the route. So prior to that, you could enter independent visits to nest sites. And in 2019, we realized, after looking at a few years of data, that we really needed all of this information to be tied to a route to be able to do this kind of analysis. So these improvements allowed us to develop this analysis strategy, and we'll be able to use data from 2019 forward to estimate breeding populations with this particular strategy for our 3 focal shorebird species. And Rhea, I think you can speak more to the question about trends.
Sure, thanks, Emma. I'm Rhea Pruner, a shorebird research scientist with FWC. So because shorebirds are management-dependent species, continued efforts will be needed to maintain and increase the gains. But the data indicate that we are in the early stages of a success story. Some beach nesting bird species declined substantially in Florida prior to implementation, as Michelle mentioned. And others, like snowy plovers, had historically low numbers, but prior data was lacking to demonstrate those declines. And there's no historical statewide data for Wilson's plovers. Unfortunately, or ultimately, we are working on a strategy to evaluate trends moving forward rather than looking backwards. We also advise against comparing the results to those from past efforts because of differences in survey strategies, spatial coverage, survey frequency, analysis strategy, and the knowledge and assumptions we used specific to the species biology. The abundance estimates we presented here today differ from previous estimates because they were produced using tools that were tailored to the data in the FSD, and analysis methods incorporated local knowledge of breeding shorebirds. In addition, as Cody mentioned, the analysis explicitly accounted for potential movement of shorebirds both temporally and spatially to reduce the risk of under and overestimating the abundance of each species. The analysis, we assumed that FSA partners documented all breeding activity along survey routes and provided complete coverage of potential nesting habitat. The comprehensive survey coverage by the FSA partners combined with the analysis strategy limited the risk of both double counting birds and resulted in a statewide population estimate that accurately represents the breeding population of each species in Florida. I know it's not the answer you're looking for, Michelle.
Great questions. Michelle or Marvin, do you have follow-up questions? Anybody else have questions? Don't be shy. Meg, you have a question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad I got to dip into this today. It was awesome to see such culmination of a lot of work, clearly. I just had a quick, I guess it's more of a qualitative question than a quantitative question, but I was just wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about potentially how you expect the sort of COVID pandemic effect to potentially influence your results as you move forward in your abundance estimates from 2020. That could be as simple as, you know, our surveyors were out there regardless, or if there's something that you're kind of warily anticipating as you look down the line.
That's a great question, Meg. Arian, do you want to tackle that? We had an indirect way at kind of evaluating this when we were looking at the 2020 data, but.
Hi, everybody. My name is Arian Jimenez. I'm another assistant research with FWI in this project. And for that particular question, I just want to mention that our abundance estimates will depend on survey effort and coverage. So that's one of the points this abundance estimate will depend. And we were concerned by the 2020 survey effort and coverage, given all the complexities we had on that year. And for our surprise, I mean, if we were expecting to have something to decline, it was totally the opposite. So we have more surveys on 2020 than in previous year. So we don't feel that our abundance estimates will be limited at this point by survey effort or coverage, because partners have managed to maintain their participation and their monitoring efforts, even when a pandemic was, wreaking havoc here in Florida.
I'll add one thing to that. What Ariam said is one thing that we did observe was we had fewer FSA partners that were able to get out and monitor, but they covered more than they typically would. And so for when you're looking at the data on the back end, you didn't notice that decline in effort when you're looking at the data, because the people that were out there still collecting data were doing more. They were covering some of the gaps that were created because people weren't able to get out. Great, thanks for the question, Meg. Marvin has another question. Will route-specific estimates be available to land managers? Great question, Marvin.
Yeah, Marvin, I can answer that. This is Emma LeClaire again. So it depends. The short answer is it depends. For this analysis in particular, as you saw, we were applying it at a relatively broad scale, and we were designing it to be able to incorporate statewide data. But as you saw, it was based on this nesting polygon idea, which is made from grouped routes. So we might be able to pare that down to the whatever management unit you need. It just depends on what species we're talking about, what the configuration of routes is in the area, and really kind of more local factors. For example, if the birds are moving beyond the boundary of your managed area, we won't really be able to scale down this analysis because it's violating that assumption of where we think or where we know birds are moving. So if your managed area is really isolated and kind of bounded by some kind of geographical features that limit bird movement, then possibly, but it really depends. And it's also important to remember the role of the temporal scale in this analysis. So if we are able to identify how many birds were nesting in your managed area, it's also important to remember that the peak in your area may not correspond to the timing of the peak at a broader scale. So even if we can figure out how many birds nested in your park, for example, it wouldn't necessarily be correct to say that makes up X% of the population, if that makes sense. So for specific land managers, if you have questions about how many birds are nesting in your park, we may be able to adapt the analysis. We'll have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but we'll do our absolute best to get you the most accurate information that we possibly can. So if you have questions like that, I do encourage you to reach out to FL Shorebird Database at myfwc.com.
Great. Keep the questions coming. Anyone else have anything? Katie has a question. Will band resite data be added to the FSD given the reliance on the data for this analysis?
Katie, that's a really good question. And that is something that we are kind of grappling with on a regular basis. Right now, the focus has been developing an analytical framework that can accommodate data that includes both banded and unbanded individual birds. And any analysis in the future is always going to need to be able to work with both types of data. But that said, it would certainly be beneficial to include band information as part of the FSD. And so we're working on figuring out how best to configure data entry for that kind of information, given the different species and the different banding needs and conventions. So until we have that banding data in the FSD, we're definitely going to continue to use those supplemental data repositories that include banding information whenever available.
Alexa has a good question. Could Cody or someone else on the data analysis team talk more about how polygons were differentiated for each species?
Yeah, here's Arian again. I can take this question. So we conducted the analysis species by species. So we filter all the data just based in one species, and the process that Cody described was done for each one of them. Specifically, we were looking at the renest. I mean, one of the most important pieces here was the renest distance grouping, as well as the temporal definition of our time frame for the analysis. And again, we were looking at the individual species for this information. So in that way, all the information coming from the renest distance or the local experts on movement of those particular birds were treated depending on the information we were gathering from them. So every single nesting polygon respond to the species we were analyzing. I don't know if that will answer your question, Alexa. Rhea, do you have anything else that you might add?
No, no, this is Ray again. No, I think, Erin, we covered pretty well. I think I'll add, as we talked a lot about renesting, a lot of the, whether it's the local information, our supplementary data source of banded birds in the landscape, a lot of that information is being used already as the data fields in the FSD. So when partners are selecting that a nest is a renest, for example, you're using some key identification factors of the birds they're monitoring. Maybe it's that local knowledge, the territorial space. They're using unique band combinations, physical characteristics, and things like that. So the data that partners are entering is informing those buffered polygons, if you will. So it's the data itself and the spatial distribution when we plot it that's informing the species-specific polygons. And as Arian mentioned, that how it's differentiated in some sense is that the unique biology of each of the species. As Cody mentioned, the narrow range in oystercatchers is because they tend to have a little bit higher site fidelity and are moving shorter distances compared to like the snowy plovers. If you caught it on that slide, they're moving close to 89 kilometers at the high peak. And so, moving much larger distances. And so that is informing the variation we're seeing in the way the polygons are drawn and how they're grouped specifically for each species. I hope that helps, Alexa.
And I want to add thank you to FSA partners for using that function in the FSD to indicate when they believe a nest is a renest, because all of that data was pulled into this analysis and helped us be able to draw these polygons for each species. Great questions. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, not seeing any more questions. If you have additional questions or you think of other questions, please go ahead and contact us via email and we will get back to you, or schedule a meeting if it's something that's more detailed. And we will let you guys know when this is up on YouTube, and we'll want to share it. We had about over 60 people sign up, and I think about half were able to join. So I think there'll be some people who will be interested in watching this once it's posted to YouTube. So we'll get this available to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And we'll be in touch as we develop trends and update the estimates for 2020 and 2021. Have a great day, everyone.